Okay, this is going to be a short PowerPoint presentation on the exploration and expansion of Western Europe into mostly the Americas, but also into Asia. This isn't really going to talk about the effects. We're going to do that next week, but this is going to be kind of the real short version of the how and the why. In your book that you read, you're going to get a lot of the why from the Spanish, but we're going to talk about mostly the Portuguese and exactly what they were trying to accomplish. Okay, first, the motives and the means. If you look at this picture, this is what is called the stern post rudder, which was an invention of the mid-1400s, which we'll talk about, which really helped the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then later the Dutch, turn into global empires. But first we need to talk about the Ottoman Empire real quickly. These were Islamic Turks from Central Asia who had moved into Anatolia, what we would now call Turkey today. And in 1453 they took over Istanbul, which was then Constantinople, which was a Christian city, kind of the Eastern European bastion of Christianity. And so Muslims took it over. As the 1400s rolled into the 1500s, the Muslim Ottoman Empire was also trying to take over the Mediterranean Sea and its emphasis on trade. The Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch, most Europeans did not want this to occur, so they had a series of naval wars against the Ottoman Empire, which eventually Europe won. But before that, we need to talk about Arab middlemen. So what was happening is overland trade, which would basically be from the Spice Islands. I'll show you a map of this later. Overland trade from China and Indonesia to Europe just cost too much money, and the middlemen were Arabs, and they were taking most of the money, and it was expensive. So the Portuguese and the Spanish were going to try to find a way to get around these Arab middlemen, and the way to do that would be to go around Africa. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but Columbus, who knew the world was round, was actually trying to get to India, going the other way, heading west, because by the 1500s the Portuguese had dominated Africa in the Cape of Good Hope, which is the horn around Africa. Some more motives that we'll talk about in more detail, but I just want you to get a grasp of it right now, would be the 3 G's, and these were God, glory, and gold. One conquistador talks about there's nothing better, as we talked about humanism and this ambition and this desire to make yourself better and to go out and do things. One conquistador talked about serving God, serving the king, give light to those who live in darkness, which would mean what they would consider heathens of the Americas, and to grow rich as all men desire. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 G's more, but this was a very big motive. Religious zeal goes along with that. Just this whole idea of the people who conquered America were treated the indigenous people of America quite poorly, but it is true that a lot of them really did go to America because they were going to try to convert as many people as they possibly could, because they were a heavily Catholic nation in Spain. We'll talk about Portugal a little later, but most importantly, I think, is this technology. In the 13th and 14th century, they began making this thing called the Portolani, which were basically detailed charts between ports, distances, and compass readings, and they would put these together, kind of a map, so to speak, but in a book form. So you began to take shape of the earth, and you began to realize that the earth is round, and so map making and these things became very important in the 13th, 14th, and then especially the 15th century. And lastly is this thing called the stern post rudder, which is actually from China, and as you can see, it's in the back, and it allows you to navigate your ship better, going longitudinally or laterally, either or. Actually, the Chinese came up with this idea, and we'll talk a little bit about, some people believe the Chinese were in America before the Portuguese and the Spanish. Also, rigging and sails. We think of boats, and we think of boats always having sails, but using rigging and using sails at the same time is something that is a pretty good adjustment that people made in boats in the 14th century. So you were mobile enough to sail against the wind, engage in warfare, and you could still carry a lot of goods at the same time. Okay, these boats, you could make boats very large once you got this stern post rudder and these rigging and sails. And lastly, they also got the compass and the astrolabe from China as well. So all of these technological breakthroughs, all of this religious zeal, all this quest for glory, these are the motives and the means that created this thirst to conquer the Americas at the end of the 15th century. Okay, so for the Portuguese, we have to remember that the Ottomans had taken over Anatolia, and that the overland route to Asia was just not easy, and it was becoming too expensive. You also have to understand Europe, especially the Portuguese who are on the far west side of Europe. There's no real central river valley, plain, or any other unifying geographical feature. During the late 1400s, early 1500s, you had a lot of governments fighting for wealth and power, and you had a land that could not necessarily support all of its population, because farming was still fairly rudimentary and it wasn't as efficient as we think of farming today. And also the bottom line is merchants were seeking to increase their productivity and lower their costs, which is a very early sign of capitalism. Okay, so we're starting to see the use of boats and machinery and wind power and water to really try to change Europe geographically. But probably most important is just this idea that they needed more and cheaper raw materials, they needed more customers, and they needed more capital to invest. And so what comes out of this is this idea of utilitarianism, which is a Jeremy Bentham idea. And this is the idea that what's good for the greatest amount of people should be good for everybody. It's the whole idea of there's this pleasure over pain. If you have 10 people and 8 people are happy and 2 people aren't, then that's a good thing, because there's more people that are happy than are not. And he says, in Europe, there's too many people in this world and there's not enough resources. So the people who are going to die first are who? The people without the resources. So this idea of going out and getting resources and thriving and making your country stronger was a very popular idea. The first real Portuguese king to really think about creating an empire would be Henry the Navigator. He was a religious zealot, and he wasn't necessarily looking for a way to gain more power and more control over countries. He was looking more to increase the faith of Jesus and to conquer the world for Christianity. It was more about souls being saved than how much gold you could put in your pocket. He also wanted to find a Christian kingdom that he had heard that there was one to fight the Muslims, which there actually was a Christian kingdom in Africa at the time. It was in Ethiopia, but Ethiopia was on the other side of Africa, so he needed some way to connect with them and try to take over Anatolia again, because the Ottoman Empire was moving into the Mediterranean. He founded a school for navigators, and he goes to Africa looking for Ethiopia, and eventually they find gold. But in 1441, they not only find gold, but they find something that's more important than gold to a lot of people, and he's kind of the first power to realize that Africa may not have all of its resources in gold, silver, some of that stuff is hard to get to, but something that was very easy to get to were people. So this whole idea of creating a slave trade in Africa starts to flourish at this time. I'll show you a picture of the Gold Coast in a minute, but the Gold Coast and the Slave Coast are very close to each other. They'll be in the Kingdom of Congo, actually. And another thing about the Gold Coast is getting around Africa was very hard, getting around the Cape, because your first 1,000 miles after Europe are waterless and barren. So what the Portuguese start doing is building forts all along the coast. And they build fortresses, they build stations, they build things where you can sail away from land for a few days or a week or a month, but then you need to get back on land and replenish yourself because it's hot there. So the Portuguese start setting these compounds up, which we'll eventually talk about, leads to them starting a slave trade for Europeans. And we'll talk about these Portuguese men a little more maybe, but you just need an idea of who they are. Bartolomé Diaz in 1487, he was the first person to accidentally round the Cape. He actually got caught in a storm, but he didn't know where he was. In fact, I believe he almost got to Antarctica, but when he got out of the storm and they got up on the east side of the Cape, he realized that he was on the right side and he had found what he was looking for. But the problem was everybody was upset at him, and he kind of found it by accident, and he had to turn around, or else there was going to be a mutiny on his ship. 10 years later, he comes back and he tells people what he did, and 10 years later you get Vasco da Gama, and he rounds the Cape, he goes to India, he comes back, and this is all to stop the Muslim monopoly on the spice trade. So he gets to Indonesia and the Spice Islands in that area, and he comes back. He came back the first time, all he had was half of his fleet, a third of his men, some ginger and some cinnamon, but he still earned investors and himself in the 100,000s of percentile investment profit. So he was, even though he came back with very little, he made an exorbitant amount of money, and he keeps going back year after year, and he soon becomes the lead navigator for the Portuguese. The real interesting thing that we want to talk about with spice is why they were so important. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but before there was refrigeration, the only way to keep things from becoming putrid in a couple of days, especially meat and produce, would be to salt it. There was no refrigeration. Also, if the meat was such a scarce commodity, if it did rot, you didn't want to just waste it, so what you needed was to make it taste as good as possible. So spices do that. So spices were a very important trade, and that's really what the Spanish were looking for when they sent Columbus the other way. So this is just a picture of the Gold Coast. You can see on the western area of Africa, that's mostly desert. North of Ghana, it's called Ghana today, but north of Ghana. So this is where they ended up finding gold, and they will also start a slave trade there, but that's just where one of the posts were set up. And then the map on the right just shows you an old version of the Republic of Congo and the Gold Coast. Okay, we're going to talk about the Portuguese a little more, and it's what a lot of historians call the reign of secrecy. And the bottom line is these guys were traveling the world, and they found the way to the Spice Islands, and they wanted to keep it a secret as long as possible. They wanted to keep a monopoly on all of these spices because they were making a fortune. Especially this King Manuel that you see here, he was very strict about this. If people opened their mouth, or if they had maps that they sold to other countries, things of that nature, they were executed. This was very serious business, and the kings did not mess around. The first guy we'll talk about is Alfonso Albuquerque. In 1510, he went around the Cape and he landed in Goa, which would be Western India, what we would call Western India today. In 1511, he lands there, and there was a local Muslim population, and he killed them all, which gave him the route to the Spice Islands, and he took control of all the Muslim populations in Western India. And I'll show you a map of the trade routes later. You'll see what I'm talking about. He was mainly successful because he was ruthless, but he also had very heavy guns. He was a very good sailor. He had heavy guns, but they had light ships that could go long distances while bombarding their enemies at the same time. So Alfonso Albuquerque, even though he's not as well known as some other guys, he is the guy who really established for the Portuguese their monopoly on pepper, ginger, and even cloves, and no one could figure out how the Portuguese got there. He was a very good sailor, and he kept his mouth shut. Earlier than him was this D'Alencourt, and he was a guy who sailed with Diaz and da Gama. He returned home once, and he boasted that he could take any ship. It was easy to get New Guinea, which is in the Spice Islands, and he could take any ship that you give him, and he could take it there. But King John, who was Manuel's father, publicly said it was not feasible, and in private said he didn't want any foreigners knowing this. He said next time D'Alencourt opened his mouth, he would be killed. So that's just an example of kind of seriousness that these people took. King John's son, King Manuel, in order to keep monopolies on pepper and on salt and on cloves and all of these spices, he ordered that no Genoese or Florentines, who are Italians, could live in Portugal, and that all the navigational maps that they made, and this is a picture of a master chart, would be kept secret upon pain of death. This actually worked quite well until the mid-1550s. I mean, people who wanted to try to get to the Spice Islands were looking at ancient texts. They were talking to overland travelers, people who had been there before. Some turncoats and some spies, but the main thing is the Portuguese really kept a tight hold on the Spice Islands until the 1550s. And like I said before, you're looking here at a master chart, which is, this is a chart of Europe, but what they did was they kept these charts in a lockbox with 2 locks and 2 keys, and one was held by Amerigo Vespucci, who was the pilot major of the Portuguese Navy at the time, and the other was a cosmographer. So it's kind of like those nuclear bomb things that you see on Harrison Ford movies or whatever. The president has a key and somebody else has a key, and you have to turn them at the same time and enter a code to launch the nuclear sequence. Kind of the same idea here, only with master charts and probably wooden or iron safes. Vespucci also is known for reaching the Amazon and exploring South America. This will be 9 years after Columbus reaches Hispaniola. He went back in 1501, and in 1501 it took him only 64 days to cross the Atlantic, and he got within 400 miles of the southern tip of South America. And he wrote 2 letters back to his friends, talking about the diet and the religion, but most importantly the sexual preferences of the indigenous people of Americas, and childbirth practices and marriages. This was a huge hit, and it was translated into 60 languages, and even Czech. He is also who America is named after, Amerigo Vespucci. Just real quick, a few problems that they had while you're keeping things secret is, while you're trying to create a monopoly, but really what it caused was a problem with recruiting and morale, because You were recruiting people to go on trips somewhere where they didn't know where they were going, what they were doing, or how long they were going to be gone. They thought they were going into what was considered uncharted territory to uncertain destinations, right? So men were scared, and if they didn't know where they were going until they had left. So there were quite a few mutinies because they were keeping it being so secretive about it, but it still worked out in their favor. And this, I want you guys to understand that this is the start of globalization that Columbus started, because for over 5,000 years of human histories, most people were contained to a small geographical area, but within 30 years from when they started trying to circumnavigate the globe to when they actually succeeded was a very, very short amount of time. And we'll talk about how easy, well, I shouldn't say easy, but how quickly the Europeans dominated the Americas. This is kind of the same idea. It only took them 30 years from start to finish to circumnavigate the globe, which was an enormous accomplishment at the time. So here's a trade route that you can see. This is post Columbus, but you can see how they came from Lisbon, Portugal. They went around the Cape in Africa, and then they landed in Goa. That's where Goa is. And then from Goa, they went to Malacca, which Albuquerque also dominated. He also took over Malacca. So from there, they could go to Macau, which is China, and they could also go to Japan. Now, this yellow line is what they will do after the 1550s, and they realized that the Americas have an East Coast and a West Coast. Here's just another example. This kind of just gives you an idea of where the Spice Islands are. You can see the Silk Road, that overland travel. That's over mountains, lots of mountains, through desert, and through a lot of hostile territory with a lot of nomads and a lot of fighting. So they needed to find another place to go. This is kind of a picture before they circumnavigated the globe and went around Africa. So what they would do is they would get the spices from Malacca or China. You can see they would go through Sri Lanka to India, and then they would either come up through what we would consider Iran and Iraq today, through Baghdad, and come out that way to the Mediterranean, or they would walk and go overland there, or they would sail up to Egypt. There's no Suez Canal yet, so then they would get in Egypt, they would go overland that way, and then they would get on ships again. So this overland travel was very time consuming, and it was dangerous. And here's a quick picture of the triangular trade. This will be more for the whole idea of slaves, but the triangle, and this will be later, much, 50, 60 years into the future, but I want you just to see it now. It starts in Europe, it goes to Africa. You take gun, clothes, beer, alcohol, things of that nature to Africa. You trade them for human beings, gold, ivory, spices, and then you either go back up to Europe, or then you go to America. The Americas. And then when you get to the Americas, you drop off your slaves, and you pick up what America has: molasses, cotton, sugar, fish, flour, all kinds of things like that, rice, tobacco. You take those to America, and it goes back to Europe, and that's what the triangle trade is. This is also what people are going to start calling the Columbian Exchange, meaning this is kind of reminiscent, or it's an outcome of Columbus reaching America. Okay, Spain was kind of in the same boat as Portugal as far as the Ottoman Empire was concerned. They really were on the defensive because in 1480, Sultan Muhammad the Conqueror actually landed in Italy. And he was marching. They were marching up through Italy, but lucky for Europe, he died. So in 1481, the Ottoman Empire decided to go back, and they never really gained the upper hand again. The Spanish were also against Portugal. The Portuguese were keeping their map secret on how to get to the Spice Islands pretty well, but that didn't mean that the Spanish didn't know what was going on. They knew that Portugal had a monopoly on the spice trade, and they wanted in on it. So they were trying to get a little bit of that trade, and the only way they could do that, they figured, was by going west, because the way around Africa had already been taken. Okay, so let's talk about Columbus. You're going to read about Columbus a little bit in your book, but mostly you know him as the guy who sailed from 1492 across the ocean blue. He was an Italian from Genoa, so he wasn't even Spanish, and he went to the king and queen and basically found favor with them and came up with this idea, because everybody by now knew that the earth was round. They just didn't know what was across the Pacific Ocean. And Columbus said, I can get to India going that way. If the earth is round, then at some point I'm going to be able to get to India. So in 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand said okay. So he arrives in Hispaniola, and he actually goes 4 more times, but he never finds a way to get to India through America. He actually names the indigenous people who he sees Indians, because the first time he went there, he thought that he was actually in India. A lot of people argue that Columbus was probably only somebody with the tenacity and the will, and maybe dumb enough to try and go west, because nobody had tried it before. He vastly erred how far west India was, and if he hadn't hit America, he would have died at some point, because you just couldn't have sailed that far. So he was actually quite lucky that America was there, or he would have died. There's this whole argument, and you'll see in some of these YouTube videos that you look at, is to whether he's a hero or a villain. A lot of people say he laid the foundation for the modern global economy. Other people view him as a symbol of colonial repression and kind of this prime mover of what turned out to be almost a virtual extinction of a people and a culture and cultures. I mean, what ends up happening is most of the eastern area of the Americas they're basically killed off, whether it's disease or through war. But the main thing is that Columbus viewed the people who he met in America, the indigenous people, with condescension, and people who could be exploited because they didn't have the technology that the Europeans had. But the bottom line is these were common attitudes among Europeans at the time, maybe even common attitudes of people today. These people were foreigners. They were probably smaller. They were probably darker in color. They didn't have the technology. They didn't speak the same language. So they were viewed as people who could be exploited. And Columbus would have had to have been this transcended time. He would have had to have been this remarkable visionary for him not to land in America and see these people and say, hey, these are people who I can exploit. I'm not saying that it's the right thing, but that is how people thought in the 1415, basically through this whole class. I mean, even up to today, we have this. So there's also this idea that even though you didn't move that far during your lifetime, especially if you were European, this whole idea of searching for a livelihood and moving and trying to find it is really a central theme of human beings since time has begun. if you're not in a position of wealth, or you don't have enough food or money or capital or products, goods, whatever you want to call it, then human beings have a tendency to go look for them, and that's what the Spanish were doing. I talked about it a little bit, but what Columbus started was what a lot of people call the Columbian Exchange, whether it's good or bad. So what you got is you got horses, cows, various grains from Europe, especially the potato, and those would go to South America, and in return you would get corn, gold, silver, human beings. And this whole idea of trading sets the stage for the modern and the global economy. I mean, that's the bottom line. And a lot of people suggest that when your economy is booming, and everything is going well, and there's not a lot of war, and everybody's healthy, that's when you get better technology, that's when you get better science, and that's when you get better industry. And Spain was very much like post-World War II America in that sense. There's a lot of comparisons. Once they found America, they became the richest nation in the world, basically overnight. And so this Treaty of Tordesillas, it's not too important, but it was signed by Portugal and Spain in 1494. And what it was Portugal said, okay, we'll take the east side of the globe, and you can have the west side of the globe. So Spain and Portugal agreed that the Spanish will take America, the Portuguese will have Asia and the Spice Islands. Of course, this is going to change, but at the time, that's how it went. And then you'll also see in your YouTube videos is this whole idea of whether Columbus discovered America or not. Actually, he obviously didn't discover America, because there was people there 15,000 years before he even showed up. But the earliest Europeans they now know were the Vikings in around 1000. They think they landed in Canada, Newfoundland, and maybe New England, and kind of came down the coast a little bit, but decided to go back. There's also this author named Gavin Menzies. If you want to look, he has a book about how the Chinese probably could have landed on the western edge of South America sometime in the 1420s. And Menzies actually gives quite a bit of evidence about this, but whether who discovered it first or not really isn't the question, because nobody really discovered it, because there were already people there. So whether you think Columbus is a good man or bad man, the truth is there's no question that he did not discover America. Okay, so here's just a map of where he landed. The red one is his first landing. He kind of just reaches Cuba. They called it Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico today, and then he heads back, and then he has three other ones, excuse me, and you can see on the bottom the dates. This is just here to give you an idea of the whole trade route. This is kind of all of the trade routes in one. Surprisingly, for such a small nation and kind of a landlocked, not really a landlocked, but land on almost all sides, little nation, the Dutch became very, very good sailors and traders. They were actually very good at the slave trade, which is probably not something to be bragging about, but this is the whole thing. You can see the triangle trade, how it went from coast to coast, and you can also see the spice trade as well. So these are all the routes in one. And that will finish our PowerPoint, and next week we will be discussing the Americas once the Europeans reach there.